Hello again. I rather suspect that most viewers will be familiar with the assertion that men and women came to Britain from the Caribbean in the years following the end of the Second World War because they knew that Britain needed to be rebuilt and was crying out for workers, because there was a shortage of labour in bodies such as London Transport, the NHS and so on. This is why so many black people came to this country and worked as bus conductors, nurses and so on. What about all those nurses, for example, who came here from Jamaica? The truth is, all is not as it is often portrayed. Take those people from the Caribbean who came to work for London Transport. It is perfectly true that London Transport had difficulty in the late 1940s and early 1950s finding enough workers in London. They began looking outside the capital, but it was hardly necessary to start looking for staff thousands of miles away. They began recruiting in the Midlands and north of England, and then later in Scotland and Ireland. This policy worked perfectly well. It wasn't until 10 years after the end of the war that they were approached by the government of Barbados. This was in 1955, and unemployment in Barbados was rising. So many men were out of work that there were fears of political violence and disorder as the unemployed became desperate, some of them turning to crime and revolutionary ideas. It struck the government that if they could unload some of these types onto the British, then it would be no bad thing. So it was that London Transport was asked to set up a recruiting office in Barbados, and the government then offered to pay the fares of the men so that they could leave the country. In other words, this was a scheme initiated for the benefit of a Caribbean nation, rather than something which would be to the advantage of Britain. In the description to this video I give a couple of links about this, including one from the Runnymede Trust. These men were brought to Britain not for our benefit, but for the benefit of a Caribbean nation. As far as the nurses are concerned, hardly any nurses came to this country from the Caribbean. The idea that many nurses came to Britain is also part of the fantasy of the Windrush generation. What actually happened was that there was a shortage of nurses in the Caribbean, but inadequate facilities to train young women to become nurses. The senior nurses in places like Jamaica were almost all white British people, expatriates. Seeing independence looming, the idea was that young women would go to Britain and train to be nurses for a few years before returning to take up jobs in their own country. This would benefit both the Caribbean nations and also Britain. For 2 or 3 years as they were learning, the trainee nurses would be working on the wards of hospitals here, and then they would return to Jamaica and other countries, a qualified body of nurses ready to take over when independence came and all the white nurses went back to Britain. It was an arrangement to the mutual benefit of both Britain and the islands of the Caribbean. Only, of course, most of those nurses did not go back once they qualified. They stayed here. This has been only a brief account of 2 of the most popular examples of immigration to Britain from the Caribbean in the 1950s, but I think it's enough people to see that the reality is very different from the fairy tale, which is now the official version, as one might put it. Hardly anybody I've ever spoken to has heard about Barbados pleading with London Transport to take the long-term unemployed and remove them from the country, and few people are aware of the nature of the agreement regarding the training of nurses either. This has all become part of the Windrush legend, which has been carefully put together over the years until few people are even aware of the reality of post-war immigration.